The other thing we should discuss is the safety of a project. We have an EMR of 0.68, I believe, which is outstanding in our industry. Typically, the major companies now are looking for an EMR of less than 1. I believe General Motors is down to less than 0.9, and they're working at less than 0.8. We've carried a less than 0.8 for the last 5 years, so the EMR is an indicator of, it stands for an experience modification rate. It's an indicator of the lost time accidents you have versus the man hours you've worked on specific projects or on your projects. You wouldn't have a customer base if you didn't have a safe record. Nobody, no client out there wants a company that isn't a safe company. It's just a fact of life.
It's very important to me to know that North American has done everything we can for our employees when they walk on the site. They have all the right tools, all the right training, so when they go into these jobs, they get them done right, and they go home to their families. And that's a very important thing to me as the owner of North American.
In 1983, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, published their Hazard Communication Standard. This important standard was often referred to as the Employee Right to Know Standard because it was developed to ensure that workers had access to information and training about the hazards of the chemicals and products they were exposed to at work. One of the major requirements of OSHA's HAZCOM standard was for manufacturers and distributors of hazardous products to develop and make available material safety data sheets for their products. But while the OSHA standard mandated very specific health and safety information about the products be provided on the material safety data sheets, HAZCOM was a performance-based standard, meaning there was no specific format that had to be utilized by the manufacturers and distributors when developing their MSDS, nor were there any standardized hazard ratings or precautions. As a result, MSDSs took on all shapes and forms, in part because manufacturers and distributors used different formats as they prepared these documents. As you can imagine, that led to a lot of frustration among workers. Eventually, it was determined that the OSHA HAZCOM standard, as written, was not meeting its original intent, which was to help employees know exactly what they were working with, how it could harm them, and most importantly, how to protect themselves. So, in 2012, OSHA revised their hazard communication standard and did away with the requirements for material safety data sheets. Now, manufacturers and distributors of hazardous chemicals and products will have to start providing a new informational document called a Safety Data Sheet, or SDS. While the information contained on new safety data sheets is very similar to that appearing on the old MSDSs, the information will now have to follow a specific format and order. There is also a standardized hazard classification system that must be utilized on all SDSs to convey information about the physical and health-related hazards associated with that product. And the revised HAZCOM standard now requires that employers train their employees on how to read and understand the new GHS Safety Data Sheet format. So the standard changed from Employee Right to Know to Employee Right to Understand. As part of the revision to their HAZCOM standard, OSHA adopted the GHS formatting requirements for safety data sheets. GHS stands for the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals. The GHS is a standardized system, meaning there will be consistency in the information appearing in safety data sheets. This system was developed by the United Nations, which means that, once fully adopted and implemented, safety data sheets for products from around the world will be prepared in a standardized format, which is important in our global economy. In the new format, all safety data sheets will be broken down into 16 separate sections. The sections will always have the same titles and will always appear in the same order. Now let's take a look at the information that must appear on GHS compliant safety data sheets, starting with Section 1. Section 1 on safety data sheets is titled Identification. This is where you will find the name of the product as it appears on the container label, and in some cases applicable synonyms or chemical classification codes used for the product. You will also find supplier information, including the name of the manufacturer or distributor of the product, their address, and emergency contact number. And on some safety data sheets you may see supplemental information about the product, such as the intended use for the product, directions for its use, and possibly an expiration date. All this information must match that appearing on the container label. The second section of a safety data sheet is titled Hazard Identification. Here you will find the GHS hazard classifications for the product, including those for each health hazard and physical hazard, and their individual ratings in applicable hazard categories. You will also find the appropriate signal word associated with the product. There are only 2 signal words that are used in the GHS system, either the word danger, which indicates a relatively severe or immediate hazard, or warning, which indicates a less severe but still potentially harmful level of hazard. This section will also display one or several hazard statements. Statements such as these 2 examples give employees a quick warning about what hazards are associated with the product and differ according to the classification and categories of hazards presented by the product. Section 2 of the safety data sheet also displays applicable precautionary statements. These are also standardized in the GHS system and in general convey information about how to prevent or lessen exposure to the hazards of a product. And something fairly new to us here in the United States are pictograms. Pictograms are standardized icons that let workers quickly identify the types of hazards associated with the product. There are 8 different pictograms for the health and safety hazards covered in the GHS system. A more detailed explanation of hazard statements, precautionary statements, and pictograms is provided on our online tutorial titled GHS Labeling Requirements, which is also available for free on our website. And last but not least, information about any unclassified hazards that are not covered in the GHS system, such as combustible dust, will be provided in this section. Section 3 of Safety Data Sheets, titled Composition and Information on Ingredients, identifies chemicals contained in the product. This could be a single ingredient for a pure substance, or 2 or more ingredients if the product is a mixture or contains impurities or stabilizers that contribute to the hazards of a product. You will also find the common name and any synonyms that may be used for the product, as well as the applicable Chemical Abstracts Services or CAS number. When the product is a mixture of hazardous chemicals, the safety data sheet will also list the concentration of all ingredients which are classified as hazards, expressed in either percentages or ranges by weight. And for chemicals where a trade secret is claimed, there will be a statement that the specific chemical identity and or its composition have been withheld as a trade secret. Section 4 on a safety data sheet describes the initial first aid measures that should be administered by responders to anyone who has experienced a chemical exposure. This information includes a list of aid for different routes of exposure, such as contact with eyes or skin, inhalation, or ingestion. Also included will be a description of the most common symptoms of overexposure, including those which are acute or delayed, and recommendations for immediate medical care and special treatment that may be needed in some severe cases. Section 5 provides the manufacturer's recommendations for fighting a fire that involves their product. Here you will find a recommendation for the most suitable type of equipment for extinguishing a fire involving the product, as well as information about extinguishers that are not appropriate for use. You will also find details about specific hazards that may develop when the product is involved in a fire, as well as hazardous byproducts that may be generated during the combustion of the chemical. And in some cases, you may see recommendations for special protective equipment or precautions to be utilized by fire brigades or firefighters. Section 6 of the safety data sheet provides the manufacturer's recommendations for responding to spills, leaks, or accidental releases of their product. This could include response measures for containment and cleanup methods to be used to prevent or minimize exposure for response personnel. This may include specific recommendations for protecting personnel involved in the response from specific hazards, such as sources of ignition or lack of ventilation, recommended personal protective equipment to prevent personnel from being contaminated during the response, and emergency procedures, including instructions for evacuation of response personnel when needed, as well as others located nearby. Section 7 will provide information pertinent to safe handling and conditions for safe storage of the product. The required information consists of precautions for safe handling to prevent or minimize the release of the chemical into the environment, to prevent exposure or contamination for personnel handling the product, and recommended hygiene practices. For example, prohibitions against smoking, eating, or drinking in or near areas where the product is being handled. And when the product is being stored, there may be a need to avoid certain incompatible materials or agents such as high heat or water that might cause the product to react. Section 8 of the safety data sheet, titled Exposure Controls and Personal Protection, lists the OSHA permissible exposure limits, or PELs, for the chemical or chemicals contained in the product. These mandatory limits dictate when it will be necessary to utilize controls such as ventilation systems or respiratory protection devices to protect workers from the ill effects of overexposure to the chemical. There may also be listings for voluntary threshold limit values, or TLVs, established by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or similar limits recommended by other groups. This section will also list appropriate engineering controls, where applicable, such as recommendations for exhaust ventilation systems or enclosures to contain emissions. And, of utmost importance, you will find the manufacturer's recommendations for personal protective equipment, or PPE, including any special requirements for providing certain types of PPE, such as respirators, goggles, or gloves. Section 9 of the safety data sheet identifies all applicable physical and chemical properties associated with the product. While most workers may not care about this type of information, safety managers and engineers may have a need to know about specific information on the product, including but not limited to: what does it smell like? What does it look like? At what temperature does the product freeze or boil? They may also need to know at what temperature the product emits enough vapors to catch on fire or cause an explosion. How much vapor must be present at the point of ignition to burn or cause an explosion, and are the vapors heavier than air or lighter. And when dealing with corrosive products, it may be necessary to know the pH of the chemical. Section 10 of a safety data sheet is titled Stability and Reactivity. Here you will find important information identifying any other materials which may be incompatible with the product, as well as any conditions to avoid during storage or handling, such as temperature extremes, shock, and static discharge. There will also be information about any conditions that could cause the chemical to react or polymerize, as this could cause the product to release excessive pressure or heat, or create decomposition products that could be harmful to exposed workers. And when applicable, this section will also provide information about stabilizers that may be needed to maintain stability of the product. Section 11, titled Toxicological Information, lists the known routes of exposure the chemical can use to get into your system, including inhalation, ingestion, and skin and eye contact. Also listed are the effects of exposure to the product, which include acute and chronic effects, applicable target organ effects, and a description of symptoms associated with overexposure to the product. There will also be specific measures of toxicity where applicable, such as LD50. That is the estimated amount of a substance expected to kill half of exposed test animals in a single dose. And if a chemical is listed as an actual or potential carcinogen, that information will be provided in this section too. Section 12, Ecological Information. Section 13, Disposal Considerations. Section 14, Transportation Information, and Section 15, Regulatory Information, all deal with requirements regulated by other entities such as the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Transportation. Therefore, these sections are not regulated by OSHA, but appear in the safety data sheet to be consistent with the GHS format. And finally, Section 16 of Safety Data Sheets, titled Other Information, lists details such as the date the safety data sheet was prepared, if this is the original version issued or a revised version, and in some cases an overview of any changes that were made during the last revision. And in some cases, the manufacturer or distributor may choose to put other information about their product in this section, as well as any applicable disclaimers. Employers are responsible for gathering new safety data sheets for all hazardous chemicals and products to which their employees are exposed, and make sure they are readily accessible during each work shift to employees while they are in their work areas. And employers must provide training to their workers regarding the new safety data sheet format. All these things must be done by the deadlines established by OSHA in their revised hazard communication standard. Speaking of deadlines, here is an overview of some very important dates. The revised hazard communication standard, which requires the use of GHS compliant safety data sheets, was published on March 24, 2012. Manufacturers and distributors of hazardous chemicals and products have until June 1st of 2015 to begin distribution of the new safety data sheets. However, many of them have already started providing safety data sheets that meet the new format or will do so long before the due date. Therefore, OSHA requires employers to get a head start and begin training all their workers on how to read and understand the new safety data sheets, and they have until December 1st of 2013 to get that training complete. And on a related note, employers must also update their written hazard communication programs to reflect the changes brought about by the adoption of the GHS system of labeling and hazard classification. So in review, the revised OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, which has the goal of making sure employees understand what hazardous chemicals and products are in the workplace and how to work safely with and around those items, requires GHS-compliant safety data sheets be developed and provided for all hazardous chemicals and products. These safety data sheets are standardized in format, will always be comprised of 16 sections that appear in the same order, and provide standardized warnings and precautions applicable to the product. Also, employers must provide training for affected workers so they can find and understand the information that appears on safety data sheets. If you have any questions about the GHS format for safety data sheets or about the hazards of any of the products you work with, contact your employer safety representative or feel free to contact the safety professionals at OSHA Training Services through our website.
It is a requirement, the policy, and top priority of North American Dismantling, also known as NADC, to provide an accident-free and comfortable work environment for our employees, subcontractors, and site visitors. We strive to achieve this by eliminating recognized hazards from the workplace. Our health and safety program and specific individual training programs were developed to assure compliance with federal regulations 29 CFR 1910 and 29 CFR 1926, state and local regulations with particular emphasis on the occupational health and safety rules and regulations that apply to our operations. Each NADC project has a site-specific health and safety plan in place. Please become familiar with this plan and abide by all its requirements. If you have any concerns regarding the safety program on this site, please contact your supervisor or the site health and safety manager. All persons prior to entry to any site upon which NADC is or will be performing work must attend and be documented as having received the following site safety orientation training. All incidents or injuries are preventable. Strict work and environmental protocol have been established by NADC to provide a safe and accident-free workplace for those involved with this project. This orientation is intended to provide our owners, representatives, employees, subcontractors, and visitors with an understanding of the inherent hazards associated with entry into an active demolition site. No single video or document can inform you of or train you in all possible hazards associated with the project. All workers and visitors to the site are required to watch this videotape to increase their awareness of potential site hazards. In addition, visitors must be escorted by site personnel at all times when visiting the site. Employees and contractors working at a facility undergoing decommissioning and demolition must review and follow the applicable sections of the Site Health and Safety Plan. All or portions of NADC work sites are considered Control Zone Access or CZA work areas. Therefore, certain safety protocols will be enforced or maintained unless these protocols are amended by NADC senior managers. Entry points into the control zone access are clearly defined. In most cases, NADC will create hard entry locations which will be locked and required approved access by the site health and safety manager. Control zone access entry is strictly limited to those that require entry for a specific purpose, such as direct work activities, necessary inspections, permits, and emergency situation. An accurate record of entry to the control zone access will be maintained on the project site at all times. This record will include all entries by personnel, whether or not they are directly taking part in daily work activities. A mandatory escort will be provided by NADC to persons entering the work area that are not actively involved with the daily activities on the project site. All NADC projects have staging areas to limit exposure to dangerous weather conditions and for exposures to collapse, explosion, or other potential environmental hazards. These areas will be clearly defined by the NADC Site Health and Safety Manager before the completion of the site safety orientation. While all incidents or injuries are preventable, if you encounter an emergency situation, the first rule is remain calm and assess your situation. If you are not in imminent peril, move to your assigned staging area. Once you have deemed your situation to be static, all incidents or injuries must be reported to your immediate supervisor. That supervisor will then contact the NADC Site Health and Safety Manager. For emergencies requiring first responders, contact your immediate supervisor who will effect the proper response. Hard hats and safety glasses with side shields will be worn at all times, including entering and leaving the site. Proper construction clothing and footwear will be worn during work hours. In effect, no tank tops, shorts, etc. Earplugs will be worn in areas where noise levels exceed the permissible exposure limit, or PEL. Contact your supervisor for testing. High visibility safety vests are to be worn at all times when entering or exiting the site, except for burners while torching is underway. The unauthorized use of cellular telephones by NADC employees is prohibited while working. Use is permitted during break or lunch periods only. It is the NADC policy that good housekeeping will be maintained at all times. Break area will be kept clean at all times. Any trip or fall leading edges will have restricted access barriers maintained while not in process. The potential hazards and corrective measures implemented to avoid any identified hazards that may be encountered during the execution of this project have been summarized in the JHA and PTP documents. The JHA and PTP documents must be read, understood, and signed off daily by all affected workers prior to any work proceeding. The JHA and PTPs will be maintained on the Project Safety Board, which will be reviewed and refreshed as required. Both NADC and the owner's safety representatives will be auditing our JHA and PTP procedures. 100% compliance is required. All operators will be trained and qualified before operating equipment and have proper certification paperwork as required. A daily equipment checklist will be completed before operating any equipment. Forms will be supplied by your supervisor and are to remain on the machines until collected by the Site Health and Safety Manager. Operators will use the supplied full-body harness, which has been inspected prior to use, with a double lanyard using 100% tie-off at all times while in the man lift. Only approved tie-off points will be utilized. Standing or working off the mid-rail in the man lift is an imminent danger offense and grounds for disciplinary action up to and including termination. All man lifts will have a ground man within visual contact at all times. While wearing a high visibility vest, the ground man will perform fire watch duties for the lifts in his area. All mobile equipment operators will observe all regulations in the site-specific health and safety plan. Refueling of combustion engine-powered equipment using gasoline or diesel fuel will be undertaken only when fire suppression equipment is readily available in case of emergency. A full body harness with double lanyard using 100% tie-off will be worn at all times when working from heights greater than 6 feet. Your supervisor will arrange and issue a hot work permit to perform hot work within the work area. No welding or torching operation will commence without proper permitting in place. A charged fire extinguisher must be available within each hot work area. NADC requires that all combustibles be removed or protected from the direct work prior to welding or torching. A fire watch individual will remain within line of sight of burners at all times. All personnel must use proper welding and torching personnel protective equipment, or PPE. These include, but are not limited to, welding shields, gloves, flame-retardant clothing, and welding gloves. Contact your supervisor or the site health and safety manager with any questions or concerns. Burners are not required to wear safety vests while performing their burning operations. Oxygen and propane containers will be transported and stored in an upright manner. Physical isolation of all utilities, including electrical, mechanical, and fire, must be in place prior to commencing burning operations in any area. All duct systems will have an isolation made, cold cut by NADC, prior to burning on the system. All first isolation cuts will be cold cut. A hazard determination and exposure assessment will be conducted by a project manager, competent individual, or designated safety person. He will determine the potential for exposure by employees and subcontractors to metals such as lead and cadmium, based on customer-supplied data, air or material sampling, and other reliable sources of information. Engineering and work practices will be developed, implemented, and incorporated into the site safety plan. The controls will include personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, housekeeping and cleanup methods, setup of a personal hygiene decontamination area, medical surveillance and first aid facilities, training or special instructions, emergency procedures, signage, placards, barricades and other warning systems, and record keeping. Health hazards associated with exposure to cadmium or other heavy metals, such as lead, include skin irritation, eye irritation, and irritation caused by inhalation or ingestion. Do not shake, blow, or use any other means to clean clothing that would cause cadmium or other heavy metals to become airborne. Cadmium or other heavy metals can also be carcinogenic, cause kidney damage, and respiratory damage. Regulated areas are created in spaces where employees are exposed to concentrations above the permissible exposure limit. Respirators are provided for employees who must access regulated areas. Respirators must be used where required. Personal protective equipment is required for employees exposed to levels above the permissible exposure limit or where skin or eye irritation is associated with exposure, and includes coveralls, gloves, head coverings, and boots, face shields, and vented goggles. Be aware of the provided washing facilities. Any employee whose clothing is contaminated must immediately remove clothing and shower. Showers and separate washing facilities will be located in regulated areas. Cadmium or other heavy metals can also be flammable and explosive in powder form. Cadmium and other heavy metals are sensitive to reaction with oxidizers, metals, hydrogen nitrate, zinc, selenium, sulfur dioxide, and tellurium. Fight fires with dry sand, dry dolomite, dry graphite, or sodium chloride. Keep work surfaces free of heavy metals and clean up spills. Use HEPA-filtered vacuuming methods for cleaning. Compressed air for cleaning should only be used with proper ventilation. Medical surveillance will be conducted within 30 days of assignment, at least annually, whenever an employee is exposed above the action level, following an exposure, whenever an employee shows signs or symptoms of exposure. Warning signs will be posted and maintained around regulated areas. Report faded or missing signs. Labels are required on all containers that contain regulated metals. Emergency procedures and first aid treatment procedures will be posted within the regulated area, on the project safety board, and in the on-site project office. As previously mentioned, physical isolation of all utilities, including electrical, mechanical, and fire, must be in place prior to commencing demolition or burning operations in any area. Before any demolition work, burning, or maintenance is performed on any machine, equipment, tool, or electrical system, they will be made totally safe before work starts by removing any source of energy or power to them, such as electrical, air and hydraulic pressure, spring or stored energy, or thermal presence such as heat or cold. NADC project superintendent shall review prior to any active demolition the lockout-tagout procedure before cutting, shearing, opening, or breaking any conduit, piping, valves, ducts, or vessels that may have a potential for the sudden release of hazardous energy. All building services that are to remain in operation during demolition or strip-out will be appropriately and consistently tagged, flagged, or otherwise identified by NADC to prevent the accidental interruption of service and potential for injury that may result. Red tagging or flagging means it remains intact and is not to be disturbed. Remember the following piping color code: red for fire-quenching fluids, orange for toxic or corrosive fluids, yellow for flammable fluids or gas, green for potable, cooling, boiler-fed, and other water, and finally blue for compressed air. Smoking is allowed only in designated areas or within 25 feet of exterior doors, excluding doors near designated hazardous areas. Harassment, including race, creed, and sexual orientation of any kind, will not be tolerated, and the party taking part will be escorted from the site. Entering or exiting through truck doors or gates is prohibited. Control zone access designated man doors and gates are to be utilized for 100% of foot traffic. NADC has developed a corporate and site-specific safety program under which you are to adhere. Violation of the policies put not only you, but those working with or around you in peril. Disregard for this safety policy has the following consequences. First offense, verbal warning. Documented by your supervisor and written verification placed in your employee file. Second offense, written warning. Documented by your supervisor and project manager and written verification placed in your employee file. Notification will be made to NADC senior management. Third offense, denied access to NADC projects for a period of 1 year. Anyone found to be involved in an imminent danger condition that places themselves or others in a life-threatening situation will be terminated immediately. Access will be denied to NADC projects for 1 year. Imminent danger consists of, but is not limited to, swinging a crane load over workers' heads, fall protection not utilized as required, burning without proper fire suppression equipment in place, lack of lockout utilization. Non-essential workers removed for any violation may be banned from NADC sites for up to 1 year. Safety in the work environment is everyone's responsibility. It is NADC's intent to partner with you, owners representatives, and our subcontractors to provide a workplace free from known hazards and to provide PPE and engineering controls to make this project a safe one. Your involvement in the site-specific safety program is obviously required, but also greatly appreciated by the NADC management team. Our commitment to safety does not waver, and we support all your undertakings on this site in that regard.